68 years ago, a man vanished behind a smile, and a marriage collapsed behind closed doors. What looked like love was already rotting in silence. The town remembered the house before it remembered the crime. White paint, clean windows, a lawn trimmed so carefully it felt rehearsed, an American flag hanging near the door, moving gently in the wind like a promise. From the outside, it was the kind of home people trusted without question, the kind that made neighbors feel safe just by existing. Inside lived a man everyone admired, a green beret, disciplined, calm, decorated. He walked with confidence, spoke with control, and carried himself like someone who had seen the worst of the world and survived it. At church, people whispered with pride when he passed. At community events, his handshake meant something. He was a hero, a protector, a man you believed in. And then there was his wife. She stood beside him in photographs, but rarely inside conversations. Soft-spoken, polite, always smiling even when no one was watching. She learned early how to stay quiet, how to let her husband speak for both of them, how to disappear without leaving the room. People said they were the perfect couple. They said it often, too often. They saw them holding hands at church, sharing polite laughter at neighborhood dinners, sitting close at public events, her head slightly tilted toward him, his arm resting just enough to signal ownership. What they didn't see were the pauses between words. The way her smile faded the moment she thought no one was looking. The way conversation stopped when she entered the room, as if something fragile might break if the wrong sentence was spoken. At night, the house changed. The lights dimmed. The walls closed in. Silence grew heavier than sound. Footsteps echoed down hallways that felt too narrow, too long. Doors opened and closed with care, not comfort. The man who wore honor during the day woke up soaked in sweat after midnight, breathing fast, eyes wide, whispering names that didn't belong to anyone she knew. She listened from the darkness. At first, she told herself it was normal. War leaves scars. Soldiers carry ghosts. Love means patience. Love means understanding. She repeated those words like prayers, hoping they would protect her from doubt. But doubt doesn't ask permission. It crept in slowly, a change in his tone, a look that lingered too long. Nights when he didn't come home until morning, offering explanations that felt practiced. His stories never changed, but they never grew either. No details, no emotion, just enough truth to end the conversation. She began to realize something terrifying. She didn't truly know the man she married. The uniform stayed pressed. The metal stayed polished. But the man inside them felt distant, guarded, hollow. He spoke less, watched more. And when she asked questions, his answers felt sharp around the edges, like warnings disguised as reassurance. Then came the first crack, a locked drawer. It wasn't supposed to matter. Everyone deserves privacy. Everyone has something they keep to themselves. She tried to close the drawer and forget she ever noticed it. But curiosity isn't the same as suspicion. And fear has a way of sharpening curiosity into something dangerous. When she finally opened it, her hands trembled. Inside were papers that didn't belong in a family home. Old documents, military forms she couldn't fully understand, names crossed out, locations she had never heard him mention, and then a letter, a single letter. It wasn't addressed to her, it wasn't even recent. But the name written inside hit her harder than any scream ever could. A name she didn't recognize, a tone she had never heard him use. Intimate, urgent, afraid. Her trust cracked, just slightly. But once trust cracks, it never seals the same way again. She confronted him carefully, calmly, the way someone does when they're afraid of the answer. He didn't yell. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain it either. He just stared at her, cold, still, measuring. In that silence, she understood something she would never forget. He wasn't deciding what to tell her. He was deciding what she was allowed to know. Fear replaced love that night, not all at once, but enough to change how she breathed in the room, enough to make her listen for his footsteps, enough to make every quiet moment feel like a test she didn't know how to pass. The house no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a place where secrets lived longer than truth. Arguments didn't explode, they evaporated. Words left unsaid hung in the air like smoke. Dinners were eaten in near silence. Glances replaced conversations. And every night ended the same way, with her lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what else he was hiding. She thought about leaving, but leaving requires certainty. And certainty was exactly what he controlled. She knew too much now. And he knew that she knew. The marriage everyone envied had become something else entirely. A quiet war fought with looks, pauses, and unspoken threats. A relationship held together not by love but by fear and unanswered questions. That night, as the house fell silent once again, she lay in the dark listening to his breathing, steady, controlled, untroubled. And for the first time a thought crossed her mind that terrified her more than any secret. If the truth ever came out, someone wouldn't survive it. And in the silence that followed, the house seemed to listen. The truth doesn't arrive with sirens. It doesn't knock. It slips in quietly and sits beside you, waiting for the moment you can no longer ignore it. After that night, nothing felt accidental anymore. She began to see patterns where she once saw routine. Late nights that came without warning. Sudden disappearances explained away with vague duty calls. Stories repeated too perfectly, as if memorized instead of remembered. His uniform stayed spotless, pressed, honored. But the man inside it felt like he was slowly fading away. He spoke less, watched more. When he entered a room, the air changed. Conversations shortened. His eyes scanned faces the way soldiers scan terrain, always alert, always calculating. At home, he locked doors that never used to be locked. He checked windows twice, sometimes 3 times. She told herself she was imagining it, but fear has a rhythm, and once you learn it, you can't unhear it. One evening, exhaustion pulled him into a deep sleep. The kind that left his face blank and unguarded. She stood in the doorway, listening to his breathing, steady and calm. For a moment she almost turned away, almost convinced herself that love meant letting the past stay buried, but curiosity won. Her hands shook as she searched, drawers, shelves, boxes tucked away behind things no one ever touched. She wasn't looking for betrayal, not then. She was looking for reassurance, proof that her fear was wrong. Instead, she found something else. Documents yellowed with age, military files marked with stamps she didn't recognize, names crossed out with thick black lines, entire paragraphs redacted, locations written in codes instead of words, places that didn't exist on any map she had ever seen. This wasn't paperwork meant for a home. This was history that had been buried. Her heart pounded louder with every page. She realized she wasn't just learning new information. She was stepping into a life that had never included her. A life he had carefully folded away and hidden behind medals and smiles. Her husband wasn't just a soldier. He had lived another life. When she confronted him the next morning, she expected anger, denial, maybe even tears. She got none of it. He listened quietly as she spoke, her voice trembling, her questions stumbling over each other. And when she finally stopped, the room went still. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain it either. He just looked at her. His eyes were cold, detached. Not the eyes of a husband caught in a lie, but the eyes of someone deciding how dangerous the truth might be. In that stare, she understood something that made her chest tighten. He wasn't afraid of being exposed. He was afraid of losing control. That was the moment fear replaced love. She saw him differently after that. Every movement felt intentional, every word carefully chosen. He never raised his voice, but his silence felt heavier than shouting. When she asked for clarity, he gave her nothing. When she asked for honesty, he gave her distance. The man who once promised to protect her now felt like someone she needed protection from. She began to wonder what he was capable of. If he could hide a life, could he erase one too? The war hadn't ended for him. It had followed him home, settled into their walls, lived in their hallways, slept in their bed. Arguments changed shape. They didn't explode anymore. They suffocated. Dinner plates clinked in silence. Forks paused midair. Breathing grew heavy for no clear reason. They spoke in half sentences, careful not to step on something unseen. Every conversation felt like a negotiation. She started sleeping lightly, listening for doors opening, for footsteps moving where they shouldn't. She memorized the sound of his breathing at night, the rhythm of it becoming a measure of safety. And still she thought about leaving. But leaving isn't simple when you know too much. She understood that now. He knew she had seen the documents. He knew she had crossed a line. And he knew exactly how much power that knowledge gave her and how much it took away. The house became a battlefield without weapons. Doors felt like traps. Corners felt watched. Every night felt like a countdown to something she couldn't name. She stopped inviting friends over, stopped visiting neighbors. The world outside felt safer than the one she slept in, but she stayed anyway. Because fear doesn't always push you to run. Sometimes it teaches you to adapt. Something inside her began to change. She stopped asking questions, started observing instead. She paid attention to what made him tense, what made him relax, what silences felt dangerous and which ones felt safe. She learned when to speak and when to disappear. Survival became instinct, but survival has a cost. The woman who once believed in honesty and love slowly hardened. Trust gave way to caution. Hope gave way to preparation. She wasn't planning anything, not yet, but she was no longer innocent to the possibility that this story wouldn't end peacefully. Late at night, lying beside a man she no longer recognized, she stared at the ceiling and counted the seconds between his breaths. Each pause felt like a question. How far would he go to protect his secret? And how far would she go to protect herself? The house answered with silence. But silence, she was learning, was never empty. The last night didn't announce itself. It didn't scream or threaten. It arrived quietly, pretending to be ordinary. The house was calm in a way that felt wrong, too still, too balanced, like the air was holding its breath. There had been no argument that evening, no sharp words, no slammed doors, just a dinner eaten in near silence and a man sitting at the table long after his plate was empty. He stared straight ahead, not at the wall, not at the floor, at nothing. She stood behind him a few feet away, watching the rise and fall of his shoulders. Her heart pounded so loudly she was afraid he might hear it. In that moment, a terrible clarity settled over her. Sharp, cold, unavoidable. If she didn't act now, she might never leave that house alive. The thought didn't feel dramatic. It felt practical, like a conclusion reached after too many sleepless nights. The secret had grown too large, too dangerous. It had turned the man she married into someone unpredictable, someone cornered by his own past. And cornered men are the most dangerous of all. She remembered the documents, the names crossed out, the places that didn't exist, the stare he gave her when she asked questions, not anger, not fear, calculation. That stare came back to her now. He was still sitting there when she moved closer, still silent, still calm. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching longer than the last. She wondered if he knew, if he sensed the shift in the room, if he had already decided how this night would end. Her hands shook. What happened next wasn't rage, it wasn't revenge, it was desperation. The kind that strips away hesitation. The kind that turns fear into action. The kind that doesn't feel real until it's already done. The violence was sudden, shocking, unimaginable to anyone who hadn't lived inside that house. It wasn't chaotic, it was controlled, almost methodical, as if survival itself had taken over her body and pushed her mind aside. There was no screaming that neighbors could hear, no dramatic struggle, just the sound of breath turning ragged, furniture shifting slightly, the awful finality of a decision that could never be undone. When it was over, the man the town called a hero was no longer breathing. By morning, the respected Green Beret was gone, not missing, not escaped, destroyed. The sun rose like it always did. Soft light spilled through the windows. Birds moved through the yard. The world outside didn't notice what had happened inside that house. She worked in silence. Her hands shook, but her movements were steady. Her mind detached itself from her body, watching from somewhere far away. This wasn't about anger anymore. This was about survival, about erasing a threat that had lived too close for too long. The woman who once believed in love no longer existed in that moment. What remained was someone trying to stay alive long enough to see another sunrise. Time blurred. Hours passed without meaning. She cleaned, she hid, she thought, then stopped thinking altogether. Every sound made her flinch. Every shadow felt like an accusation. When it was done, she sat down and waited. She didn't run. That part confused people later. Friends, neighbors, investigators. Why didn't she flee? Why didn't she disappear the way so many others in similar stories did? But she understood something they didn't. Running looks like guilt. Waiting looks like confidence. When the body was discovered, the town shattered. Police cars lined the street. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering behind their hands. The house that once made people feel safe now felt cursed. Reporters came. Cameras followed. The story spread quickly, growing darker with every retelling. The hero they admired had fallen, not in combat, not overseas, but inside his own home. Details emerged slowly. Disturbingly, the brutality of the crime stunned even seasoned investigators. This wasn't a crime of passion, they said. This was something else, something colder, something planned or forced into being by fear. They looked at her with questions in their eyes. She met their gaze calmly. She answered what she could, withheld what she couldn't, her voice steady, her expression unreadable. Some saw a monster. Others saw a victim who had gone too far. No one could agree on which version frightened them more. As evidence piled up, so did rumors, affairs, hidden missions, classified operations that never officially existed, a double life concealed beneath medals and honor. The more they uncovered, the more complicated the story became. And still she waited. Because some secrets don't die quietly, they claw their way to the surface. They stain everything they touch. They demand blood, truth, or both. Late at night, alone in a holding cell or interview room, she replayed that final evening in her mind. The calm, the silence, the moment she realized there was no safe ending left. She wondered if things could have been different, if speaking sooner might have saved them both. If love, once broken by secrets, ever truly had a chance, the answer always felt the same. Some truths come too late, and some choices once made can never be undone. As the case moved forward, one question hung in the air, unanswered and uncomfortable. Was this a murder or the final act of a war that had never really ended? The town waited for justice. The courtroom waited for truth. And she waited too. Because the worst part wasn't what she had done. It was knowing that the final judgment hadn't even begun. The truth finally spoke, and when it did, it shattered everyone who listened, because some lies survive war but not a courtroom. The trial drew crowds before it ever began. Reporters packed the benches. Neighbors whispered in hallways. A town that once stood proudly behind a decorated soldier now sat quietly, unsure of what it wanted to hear. Justice, maybe, or reassurance that the world still made sense. It didn't. Box by box, the evidence came forward. Military files stamped with words the public was never meant to see. Missions never acknowledged. Orders never written down. Pages filled with redactions, black lines swallowing names and places whole. Acts committed far from home, buried beneath medals and ceremony. The hero image cracked. Witnesses spoke carefully, as if afraid the truth itself might punish them. Experts explained how violence reshapes a person, how war can hollow someone out, then teach them how to hide the emptiness behind discipline and honor. The man they described sounded less like a protector and more like a weapon that never learned how to turn itself off. And sitting just a few feet away was his wife. She listened without reacting, her face calm, almost still. Some in the room mistook that for coldness. Others saw exhaustion carved too deeply to show emotion anymore. She didn't flinch when his past was exposed. She had lived with it long before anyone else knew it existed. When it was her turn to speak, the room leaned forward. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't claim innocence. She spoke about fear, about nights spent listening to footsteps, about realizing too late that love can become a trap when secrets are used as control. Her voice stayed steady, but her words landed heavy. She wasn't painted as a hero, but she wasn't painted as a monster either. The prosecution spoke of brutality, of planning, of a crime too calculated to ignore. The defense spoke of survival, of a woman cornered by a man shaped by violence and silence. Both sides were right in ways that made the truth uncomfortable. The jury listened, watched, waited, and behind their still faces lived a question that no one could answer easily. When does fear turn into justification? When does survival cross the line into destruction? The verdict came quietly, guilty. There was no gasp, no shouting. Just a collective exhale, as if the room had been holding its breath for months. She stood as the sentence was read, eyes forward, shoulders straight. Prison walls would close around her, but the punishment didn't end there. Because this story didn't belong to just one person. It belonged to everyone who had chosen silence over truth, to a system that rewarded honor without asking what it hid, to neighbors who admired from a distance but never looked closer. The sentence carried more than time behind bars. It carried a lesson. Secrets destroy, silence kills, and violence, no matter the reason, always leaves ruins behind. Years passed, the house was sold, the town changed. New families moved in. Children played on streets that once held police tape and cameras. Life went on the way it always does, stepping carefully over the past. But the case never disappeared. It lived in old newspaper clippings, in true crime documentaries, in whispered conversations that resurfaced whenever someone mentioned trust or marriage or the cost of keeping quiet. 68 years later, people still argue about what really happened inside that house. Some say she was a victim who ran out of choices. Others say she became exactly what she feared. Both sides search for comfort in their version of the story. But the truth doesn't offer comfort. It offers warning. Because monsters don't always look like monsters. They don't always hide in dark alleys or abandoned places. Sometimes they wear uniforms. Sometimes they earn respect. Sometimes they come home every night and sleep beside you. And sometimes the most dangerous thing of all is believing silence will keep you safe. The case remains unresolved in the only way that matters, not legally, but morally. It asks questions we still struggle to answer about fear, about love, about how far a person can be pushed before something breaks forever. The courtroom emptied. The files were closed. The sentence was served. But the echo of that silence still lingers, because the cost of truth is high, and the cost of silence is higher.